Okay, so
This meeting is being recorded.
Yep.
okay, so yes, hello. I'm with Paul Pearson today, and hello, Paul. Thank you ever so much for coming along.
Pleasure. Thank you, Gerard.
Yeah, it is a pleasure. Just to give you a quick introduction, and correct me if any of this is kind of not accurate, really, but the way that I've known you is because you are a part of the pagan scene, and you have edited Greenmantle Magazine for 30 years. Is that
Up
right?
to 30 years, yeah.
Yeah, that's mad, isn't it? And you've also written this book, which I found brilliant. It's called The Mountain and the Stream, and you've co-written it with Tallis Harrill. Is that how you say Tallis Harrill?
Yeah.
Yeah, good.
Tallis Harrill, yeah.
Yeah. And it's I think it's quite a mind-blowing book. I think it's an incredibly sensitive and beautiful book, and it's essentially about rural animism and pagan practices. So I want to go on to talk about those two things a bit later, but what I kind of want to do is go through it a bit chronologically, it being your life, really. Yeah. So can you start off by perhaps telling us a little bit about your upbringing, how you grew up, and perhaps any kind of clues that kind of led you in the directions you went?
My childhood was strange. There was a certain sadness about my mother, and my father. I didn't really have much of a great father-son relationship, because he was working most days and doing quite a lot of private work in the evening. So he wasn't that great father figure. He was more of a mother figure. I had a pretty standard childhood. My father was a bit strict in some ways. When my mother died, I was only 16, and I had a big fallout with my father then, because he got remarried shortly afterwards, and I went my way, and we was estranged for quite some time. Then I got married. I saw him again. We got together again when I got married, and that was fine. But the marriage lasted about 2 years. It was a bit of a failure. And then I moved to Brighton, and I fell in with a group of bohemian types, arty types, who were wonderful to be with. And I was asked if I would help at a festival up there. It's the Earth Spirit Festival. And I was working on the site, only to find that the first day we got there, they discovered that they couldn't use the site and had to relocate to another site. And so I worked on that, and we did it on the promise that they would let us have a table free of charge, and we'd have free admission, and we would have a table for this artist cooperative, which was the group of people I was involved with. What happened then was typical of a typical festival. The weather went horrifically wrong, and there were gale force winds blowing through it. Loads of stalls and tents were actually blown away. And because we had a fairly rigid bender, ours was the only table really that survived. About 3 tables survived, I think. And a guy called Tam came over, and he worked for Pagan Link at the time. And he had a lot of pagan material on his hands. He said, "Can I put this on your table, please? And I'll be very grateful." And I said, "Yeah, certainly, no problem. Just stick it there and we'll give it out, whatever." And for the
Sorry
whole
about that's my phone. How amateur. Let me just kill that noise. Hold on a second. That's my mum. Oh. Sorry about that. Even Bill Grundy never had that happen. Sorry, carry on.
That's good. Yeah, so we took this guy's material for Pagan Link, Pagan Federation. I think wasn't quite going as well then. And we never saw him again. And people kept coming to the table and asked us, if there was anything going on locally in Sussex, Brighton and the surrounding areas. And I said, well, this isn't our material, actually. But if you give us your name and address, I'll pass it on to Tam when he comes back, and he'll hopefully get in touch with you. As I said, Tam never came back, and we ended up with this list of people who wanted to know what was happening on the pagan scene in Brighton and around Brighton. So we decided to do a one-off newsletter called Greenmantle. It was named after a book we were reading at the time. And before I know it, it suddenly sort of evolved into a magazine. I don't know how that happened. It was supposed to be sort of like a 4-page newsletter just for those people who would sort of put their name and address down. And before I even published the first issue, before I even finished the first issue, I get a visit from John Bell Payne, who was the one of the Pagan Federation regional organisers, and another couple, Fran and Rob, who were from Worthingway, I think. And they were all interested in what I was doing. And I sort of said, I'm not actually doing a great deal. And that's how Greenmantle started, basically. Everyone was enthusiastic, so I just expanded it. But I have had, obviously, experiences in the pagan world prior to that. When I lived in Manchester, when I was estranged from my father, I was involved with a high priestess called Barbara Brandolani, who was something of a public figure then. She was in the newspaper, on TV. She was sort of very much a media witch, but she was away from the screen and the public view. She was a really amazing person. And so I learned a lot from her. And prior to that, I learned some various pagan practices in rural Cheshire, working on a farm for a few months. To sort of being overall involved in paganism. When I did Greenmantle, it grew exponentially. People like John Bell Payne, who ran the Centre for Pagan Studies in Brighton, and later created the Doreen Valiente Foundation. He became a good friend, and he kept spurring me on to continue the magazine. I tried to give the magazine up several times. I wanted to shelve it. I was getting bored. And this was just prior to the internet, allowing people sending me articles through the post and the mail, and then having to retype them by hand because I couldn't scan it or anything like that. And cut and paste literally was a pair of scissors and some glue. So I was getting tired of the hard work there. And then computers came along, and I could do basic layouts on a computer. I thought, okay, we can start again now. And we started again, and we went from strength to strength. And finally, John Bell Payne died a few years ago, and he had gone to live in Spain with his wife Julie, and it all sort of fell apart in Brighton. There was, we loved Brighton, but it was time to move on. And so just after our 20th anniversary, I couldn't believe we had 20th anniversaries, we packed up and came up here to the Peak District, which is more suited to our way of life nowadays. But of course, before we came up here, I spent some time in Italy, where my old high priestess, Barbara Brandolani, had moved to. And she asked me basically to stay in Italy at her place, and it's a place called Gibizzano, for a few months. It's a bit out of the blue. I'd not spoken to her for ages. Said, coming over a couple of months and look after me animals, because I'm coming home to see the family. So I went over there for a few months, and I met some of the local Strega there, and they introduced me to various people, and they gave me a good sort of bit of groundwork into what they do over there, what their pagan practices were. And they were clearly, they knew about Barbara, but they were just very, very friendly, and it seemed to me as though they wanted their traditions to be preserved, because the younger kids just wanted to get out of the countryside, didn't like the rural life. Most kids, like, live in the countryside, want to go to London, the smoke, the big city and all that. And they literally were losing their children. They were sort of just flying off as soon as they could. I spent some time with them, which led to the mountain stream, obviously. So we came up to Derbyshire, the Peak District, and here we are now. We're carrying on stuff. Things have kind of snowballed since we moved from Brighton. I'm a trustee now of a charity called the Pagan Aid. It's a registered charity. I was asked to be a trustee on that. I've been working, of course, with the Centre for Pagan Studies and various other pagan groups, and we're members of the Pagan and Heathen Symposium, which is a group of various pagan groups who've come together to try and help the pagan community. You know, we cover things like abuse that happens in the pagan community, issues like pagan weddings, trying to get them in a legal format, and so on and so forth. So it's been quite a busy time, and we don't stop. It's been a continuous slog. When we finish one project, another one crops up. The present time, we've got a book on alchemy coming out soon, and we've got our 30th anniversary celebrations up here in New Mills next June, which again kind of happened by accident, like all my things do. I never plan these things. These things just come to me, and I just sort of run with them. Yeah, okay, I've got nothing better to do. I'll do a magazine. You know, nothing better to do. I'll do that. So.
Well, okay, that's taken us through quite a lot of things. I'd like to go.
It's a bit disappointed. I like doing flashbacks.
Yeah, no, that's cool. I'm quite interested in how you started, how you discovered stroke connected first with sort of paganism. First off, I mean, did you have a religious upbringing? But were you like a Christian?
No. Technically, I was C of E, but you know, the family only ever went to church for weddings and funerals. That was it. They were religious in name only. No one had any religious thoughts. My mother was very fey. She was always kind of, she liked a fancy world. She had this wonderful dream about Scotland. I used to think she had Scottish ancestry because she loved Scotland so much, but it was the landscape of Scotland and the romance of the Scottish romance that really sort of appealed to her. So she had a kind of a yearning like that. So no, I think how I became interested in this sort of thing was when I was at primary school. We was read a book by our teacher every week. She serialized it over a couple of months, called The Weird Stone of Brisingamen by Alan Garner. And it had a great effect on me. I was absolutely addicted to this book. In fact, I got so fed up waiting for the next week for the next chapter, I went to the library and pulled it out, and by the time the teacher had got to the end of the book, I'd already read the sequel as well. And in that there's a lot of mythology. One of the beautiful things about these books is that they are set in real locations. The first two books set in Aldesley Edge in Cheshire, which is just up the road from here. And the great thing about it was that as a kid, we used to go and see my grandmother every Sunday, and we used to pass near Aldesley Edge every Sunday. So it was like, this is magical land for me. It was very magical. And it wasn't until a few years later than that I actually got to go there properly. But I fell in love with it, and I followed Garner's work, and I still do. I still, excuse me, very much involved with his writings and stuff. So that inspired an interest in the mythology of the landscape and magic in general, because in The Moon of Gomrath, he's got a little set of notes at the back saying that all the locations are real, all the magic's real, and he'd done his research at the British Museum and so on and so forth. So I started doing the same thing. I was looking up folklore, magic, and the history of stuff. And then, of course, I went the way that most pagans did. I immediately started reading Dennis Wheatley for some bizarre reason. Why we all go in that direction, I don't know, but it always seems to be a good laugh. And yeah, I started really getting into myth and legends very much as a child. I was into the Arthurian legends. Again, that stems to Alan Garner's book, which sort of features a bunch of knights buried underground. And my mother used to encourage it. She seemed to have a sort of love for that sort of thing. That romantic fantasy was sort of ingrained in both of us, I think. And it was only about when I was 18, 19, I came across this group that was studying folklore in near Eccles in Manchester. And I went along to these meetings. They were held originally in the library. And they were ostensibly supposed to be talking about myths and legend and folklore. But they're very quickly showing that they were doing nothing of the sort. They were teaching us about witchcraft. And they stopped holding it in the library and actually moved it to their house. And it was indeed becoming very much a witchcraft thing. And they published a magazine called Ig News, which is all about Earth mysteries. And I was sort of like really interested in this. We went out, we did dowsing and things like that. I found it all interesting. And then they showed me this picture of this woman in the newspaper who'd opened a witchcraft shop in New Moston. And I went along to say, I'll investigate it. I've always wanted to be a writer. I can do an expose for your magazine. And he said, right, great, go for it. And I went to it. There's a little shop called The Witchery, and it was run by Barbara Brandolani. And I went into the shop. I was very quiet. I just went to the shop, had a look around, bought some incense and toddled off to the pub for a pint. And I thought, I need to go back to this shop for some reason. And after I'd finished my pint and had a bit of lunch, I went back, and she kind of knew that I was going to come back. And we had a nice little talk. I found she was quite fascinating. And before I left, she invited me to her place the following week. I said, come on over. We're having a meeting next Saturday. And, I think you'd find it interesting.
When is this? What kind of year are we talking about?
We're looking at the late 70s, early 80s here.
Okay.
I'm terrible for dates.
That's close enough.
It's the old age, I think. So yeah, I went to her place, and it was a magnificent house called Ravens Leach. It was a beautiful house. She had one room, which is a very large room, which is called the tarot room, and it was like something that you see in a movie. There were stars and planets on the ceiling. There was a smell of incense. There were various occult furnishings around the place, and a group of about 20 people who had also been invited. And she came in and she talked to us and said she was going to demonstrate a cone of power, and we were going to raise a cone of power, which we did do. And I recall I was very, very faint about it. When we was going through it, I was feeling kind of faint because of the energy that was being generated there. Or it could have been the heat of 20 people in one room. And then when we closed it down and everyone started to go their way, she was greeting everyone out of the door as they left. And for most of them, it was lovely to see you. Thank you. Good night. But there's a few of us, it was sort of lovely to see you. Come back next week. And that's how she was getting her group together. She invited these people back, and it became slowly the Hermetic Horde of the Silver Blade, which was really just a made-up name for no reason, because we just needed to have a name, and we thought it sounded impressive. She was actually no set denomination in her witchcraft. She wasn't Alexandrian, Gardnerian. She was very much a person of the land, a person of intuition and sort of natural magic. It was the wise woman type figure, and she was very, very I don't know the word for it. She cast a glamour over everybody, and she took a liking to me, because every time I went there, I would end up staying there for about 3 or 4 weeks at a time. And you'd always say, oh no, you must stay the night, because tomorrow we're going to do this, and you must stay over later, and next week we've got to do this. And so I was basically living there for half the time. And there was some wild escapades. There was stuff that we did on TV, and there was always having the press round. And in the end, the reason I kind of left was because I went down to Essex and I met this woman who was to be my future wife. And I came back and I was planning to go and visit her again. And Barbara sort of said, if you go there again, you won't come back. And she was pretty much right. I actually moved up there shortly afterwards, or moved down there shortly afterwards, and didn't get back to see Barbara for about 8 or 9 years, which was kind of sad, but that's how it goes. But every time, you know, we met each other, it was like wonderful, great rapport between us. And when I'd moved to Brighton, I'd lost touch with her completely by the time I got to Brighton. And then one day, just out of the blue, I get an email from her daughter. I don't know how her daughter got my email address, because the email didn't exist when we knew each other. And she sort of said, my mum would like you to help us out and go to Italy. And that's how that started. It's always very strange. Whenever there's something happening with Barbara, it's always weird. There's no straightforward ways with her. There's no straightforward communication. You know, she knew when I fell ill. She knew when I was doing this. She'd always be in touch at a specific point when it needed to be in touch. So yeah, and that's pretty much that. I've worked with various other people along the way. At one point, I met up with Maxine Saunders, probably the mid to late 80s, when she was still living at Clanricarde Gardens in London, with the possibility of joining one of her Alexandrian covens, which I declined in the end for various reasons. And so I went to do my own thing, really. I met up with various people, like I say, in Sussex with the Pagan Fed. There were people in Eastbourne that I worked with, in Worthing, and so on. So, yeah, it's a bit of an eclectic history, really. It's sort of scattershot, but kind of interesting at the same time.
It is interesting. I'm fascinated by you're talking about your introduction to witchcraft and going to people's houses, working with them, etc., etc. I'm quite interested in the kind of whole identity aspect of it. Did you always think of yourself as a witch in this kind of respect, or did you just think of yourself as Paul who happened to be doing this stuff?
Well, it was kind of I never thought myself as a witch, because I was still in the mindset that a witch was the stereotypical woman. She was a hag, she was a witch, and that was that. I like to think of myself, this is after I got into the Dennis Wheatley books, as more of a magician. You know, I wanted to be that magician. I wanted the black gown, I wanted the hood, I wanted the whole kit and caboodle. We all did. We all did. We all did that. I mean, I was hell of a shock when I went to join Alexandrian Coven, and you know, they were sort of saying, you know, we do wear robes, but they're white. White? No, white. You can't have white. But yeah, that was that.
So the whole kind of witchcraft thing seems to have, from my perception, changed quite a lot over the years. I should imagine Harry Potter's probably had a bit of an influence on how people treat everything. I mean, we've gone from the sort of the secrecy pre-1951 to, like you're saying, people like Barbara going on the television, and Alex Sanders, of course, and all that kind of sensationalist stuff. And now it seems to be a lot more accepted and mainstream. Are they the kind of changes you've seen in time?
Yeah, it always became very sort of cloudy in the sort of 70s and 80s, especially the 80s, because you were getting supporters of witchcraft writing to places like the News of the World, sort of saying, no, we do not, not run around naked and have sex and everything. And then, of course, people like Janet and Stuart Farrar would bring out their books, which would say, indeed, they do dance around naked and have sex and stuff. So it got very confusing for a lot of people. So it was that contradiction, I think, which upset a lot of people, which led to the satanic abuse stuff as well. And I think after that, people start, I mean, I think just at the time of the satanic abuse stuff, pagans and witches were trying to be very civilized about it, because if there was any thought of nakedness or children involved or anything like that. You know, it'd have social services on the doorstep. So they tried to clean up the act, even though it didn't need it. And it became a bit sanitized in a way. And that's I think that's traveled through as well, because a lot of the covens nowadays, which at one time was sort of very staunch Gardnerian or Alexandrian, have gone very sort of mild and a little bit passive now. But certainly we noticed changes when things like Buffy the Vampire Slayer came out, and Charmed, and Harry Potter was obviously the ultimate one. And you got the teen witch, and it seemed like, and still does to a degree, seemed like a lot of them are a little but cosplaying. You know, that a lot of them have taken on board the glamour that they've seen on TV and try and squeeze it into their own life. And it always looks a little embarrassing, you know. I mean, I've seen, you know, fully fledged witches, Wiccans, and they've talked to the press and they call ordinary people muggles. And I cringe at the thought of that. It's, you know, that's a made up word for a children's book. If you keep coming out with that, the public are going to see that we are just playing children's books here.
Yeah.
I mean, I was in touch when I was doing the magazine, and sometime before his death, there was a chap called Michael Howard who ran a magazine called The Cauldron. And he and I corresponded quite often, and he said he'd like to see witchcraft go underground again, because all the publicity and all the people jumping onto the bandwagon, because it became very faddish, had sort of marred it for a great many people. And he wanted to see it go underground again. And I was half agreeing with him. As much as I'd like it to be seen as a respectable spiritual path, you know, I didn't want to see it as a joke.
Sure. Yeah, sure. You talk about the Gardnerian and the Alexandrian strands or whatever of witchcraft. Did you kind of, were you drawn more to one than the other, or, you know, what's your sort of feelings about all that?
Well, no, I wasn't really, because by time I was getting introduced to covens, because in the early days of witchcraft, it was very hard to be given membership to a coven. It was very hard, and you were tested. And the only person who'd easily accepted was Alexander's. He used to sort of have people on a conveyor belt in London. But that meant going to London. And for some of us poor people living in Manchester, that was a far distant land. And so we never really got that often. That was paradise. It was out there. So I'd got the sort of land magic I was doing with the farming community. And I never saw it as witchcraft as such. I never really saw it as magic as I sort of envisioned magic at the time. And when it came to being introduced to Wicca proper, I was kind of leaning towards it because it was the only organized strands that were available. And I was, like I say, I was given the opportunity to go and meet Maxine Saunders in London, which I did. And something struck me then, which was like, I didn't like this idea of these organized religions, or sort of these organized streams of witchcraft, because they seemed to be personality based to a degree. You know, a lot of people like to be, you know, I am the high priest or I'm the high priestess, and they're very strict with their rules. I'm fine with strict. I'm fine. But it just didn't seem right to me, because I was more connected with the land. I always had been. And I wanted to get into Wicca because it was a way into the pagan world. But in the end, I just sort of like, no, I feel like I'd be selling myself out. I'm not really a Wiccan. I might call myself a country witch, perhaps, or a heathen of some kind, or even a cunning man. But I don't think Wicca, as it properly should be done, is for me. I mean, there's a lot of people out there. We mention it in our book, sort of like you have Wiccans with a capital W and Wiccans with a small w. And the lowercase ones call themselves Wiccans, and they're not. They take on board Wiccan practices, Wiccan beliefs, but they just mold it in their own way. Whereas the high Wiccans, the ones with the capital W, they're the ones who have their set regimes, their set rituals, and it's all very solid, and it's good stuff. You know, I've always said the one good thing about Wicca is that it does instill a certain amount of discipline which you need when you're doing magic, you know, or witchcraft or stuff. A lot of these teen witches, the ones with the lowercase Wiccans, are really not having the discipline. They're just doing it as and when they please, but with no rigidity in their practices. But that's fine for them, as long as they don't impinge on my world. They're fine.
You've mentioned the farm once or twice, meeting people who had land-based pagan type practices. I can't remember exactly how you described it, but I'm quite fascinated by that, because it brings to mind stuff like the Wicker Man, of kind of, you know, rural communities kind of doing this pagan thing. And is there a lot of that about, or were you just incredibly lucky to chance on something rare?
I think I was incredibly lucky. If it happened today, I'd think it was even more incredibly lucky, because these smaller tight-knit communities no longer exist. They've been sort of overtaken by public transport, main roads, and housing estates. It was a similar sort of thing that I saw in Italy. It's like these were people who were doing stuff that they didn't really know the history of themselves. They were just carrying on from what their parents had done years before and their grandparents had done. And to them, it wasn't anything special. That's what really drew me to it, is because they weren't sort of saying, "Oh, we're doing magic stuff." You know, they were sort of like,
Yeah.
"All right, let's go and do this in the fields," you know, or do this over here in the stones. It was, to them, it was part of their way of life. It was just something they did. It was nothing special or incredibly important as such. It was as important as milking the cow. It was as important as getting the crops in, because it was all related to that. So in a way, it was not anything rather special. And I always clung by it, because there's something you get when you're in a rural sort of tradition like that, is that you just become part of the landscape, and you don't have to worry about learning the Kabbalah or anything like that. You learn through experience, and there's few of them. When I moved to Derbyshire, like I say, I left the farm many years ago. We went up to where the farm was. It's still there, the farm. It's not owned by the same people anymore, though. And we found the grave of the farmer who I worked with, which is quite sad. He died just about a year before we moved up here. The farm was empty. It was up for sale at one point, and it was very tempting. It was only about 120,000. I thought, ooh, but no. So yeah, we went back there, and it's all gone. But before we started the book, or maybe it was just after we started writing the book, I got a parcel through the post. It was a big padded envelope, and inside it was a sickle. And this was the sickle we used to use in the sort of rituals and the rites we had on the land. And it was sent to me by a woman called, I think her name was Jill. I can't remember her name. And she was the widow of one of the last farmers who had been alive, who took part in the practices. And she just sent it on to me, and with the sort of note, sort of saying, you know, he thought you'd appreciate this. Never heard of her again either. But yeah, they sent me this sickle, and I can only assume that all the people that were involved at that point have now passed over or gone. Some may still be alive. They might have just moved away or something, but they clearly aren't there. I don't think they're there anymore, but you never can tell, because you wouldn't notice.
Yeah.
I mean, the only reason I noticed was because I was working on the farm, and I got talking to the farmer, and one thing led to another. We started talking about folklore and magic and legends in the area, and he was very receptive to that, and that's how I came to slowly drift into it. But anyone else who'd been working on the farm in a similar sort of scheme that I was, called the WOOF scheme, which is working on organic farms, they just go there, fix a fence, you know, milk the cow, do the usual thing, and go home. They'd never have chats about mythology and landscape. They're talking about, how do you fix a barbed wire fence? You know, how do you do this, do that, do the other? Because they were more interested in the agriculture. I was more interested in the land generally. So yeah, there could still be people out there. You just don't see them.
Yeah. This would lead us nicely onto the kind of animism and all that. But firstly, I want to take a little detour. In fact, actually, I want to get a bit of news of the world on you. Not in any kind of horrible expose way, but magic, the perception of magic and ritual and so on. You hear so many stories, presumably of very varying believability, but and at the risk of sounding sensationalist, what's the kind of weirdest stuff that you've been exposed to in terms of supernatural experience or stuff like that?
Oh, weirdest stuff. I don't know. There's lots of little things, you know, like during rituals, watching candles burn underwater, bizarrely, and people doing path workings and getting so involved that they had difficulty bringing themselves out. I've never seen anything that would be sort of classed as sensational. The closest thing I saw was when I was with Barbara many years ago. She had this woman who had a problem, because she used to help out a lot of people with her magic and stuff. And she had a woman with a problem. I don't know what the problem was exactly. And I walked in there to take her some stuff that she wanted. And this woman's there just in a bra and stuff. And Barbara's sort of rubbing dough all over under her armpits and around her neck to get the essence of it. She was going to bake this dough in the oven. And she sort of said to me, "Oh, come in, scribe, this is sex magic." And it's sort of like, what? And I said, no. And she explained to me afterwards, it's sort of like she's getting the dough, she's trying to get the essence of the woman, the sweat and anything like that onto the dough, that she could bake it and use it in a practice. And that's really the most sensationalist thing I've seen. Because usually, yes, I've been in, you know, I've been in robe circles, I've been in skyclad circles, and I've never seen anything bizarre or outrageous. I have seen and come across very weird things that have happened generally. You know, it's like I say, when Barbara managed to get hold of me again by her daughters, it was out of the blue. There's no way she should have been able to know about my email address, because she never knew I had one. Little things like that.
You've seen entities and stuff like that, I think, is what I was wondering about. You know, have you seen stuff that, well, I don't know, stuff out of Dennis Wheatley novels, perhaps, I guess.
Oh yeah, no, you get. I've seen not strange things like any demons or anything coming up, but strange things that happens, like lights suddenly going out. You know, someone feeling very faint or even fainting. But I think more of the magic that people is more than anything. There has been stories. There's one story with Barbara actually, which it was in a book as well that I read lately.
Oh, you've gone quiet, Paul. Maybe that's one of the strange things. Can you hear me, Paul?